When I had a bad day, it was nothing's wrong. I've got this. I am strong enough. Nothing's going to break me. In order to cope with that, I would go gamble to quiet the chaos inside. At the end of a month, I ended up with a somewhat substantial win. So in our brain, the end of the month is the time to play. You could also argue that I've been gambling since I was 6. It's kind of a tricky, almost chicken or the egg. Did the gambling happen before I even knew it, or was being aware of it what made it gambling?
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the One Day at a Time podcast. Today's guest is Brian W. He's a person with lived experience with gambling harm, and we're going to be talking about his story as well as what he's doing now to give back to the community. Brian, thanks for joining.
I'm thrilled to be here, Rob. It's good to see you.
I really appreciate it. Let's just dive right into it. You are a person with lived experience of gambling harm. Where did it all start? When was that first time you placed a bet?
It's always kind of an interesting situation because I could say that I started at 21, right? Here in Oregon, most of the bars and delis here have these like video lottery terminals. They kind of play like little mini slot machines. On one hand, I would say that that's kind of where I started placing bets and gambling as I recognized it. But if you go further back through like family get-togethers where we were playing 21 and everybody had pennies and they'd play for pennies and quarters and all that, you could also argue that I've been gambling since I was 6. So it's kind of a tricky, like almost chicken or the egg. Did the gambling happen before I even knew it, or was being aware of it what made it gambling?
Interesting. In those, family events where you're playing the games at 6 years old, 7 years old, were there family members of yours that were gambling a lot? Was it something that was kind of normal at family events?
Yes, that was very normal. That was actually kind of a rite of passage, that when you got invited to the adult table to play 21, it was almost like this rite of passage that all my cousins and siblings went through. But there were definitely signs that like my family had. I can remember that my grandpa worked for Warren Industries, and so the two main themed coffee cups that he had were Warren and Reno. There were little signs that maybe gambling was kind of attached to my family. And certainly later on in life, recognizing that like my mom certainly experienced gambling harm and my grandma experienced gambling harm. I wasn't aware of those things as much. It's one of the detriments of like having begun gambling before gambling was even recognized as an addiction, like a DSM certified addiction. I didn't know that it was an addictive thing. I thought that it was a compulsive thing, a willpower thing. I'm obstinate enough. I didn't think that it would get me, just like my mom was obstinate enough that she didn't think it'd get her, and my grandma was obstinate enough. So it's certainly been a journey, something that my whole family on my mom's side has had to kind of wrestle with.
As a kid, are you noticing that your mother was struggling in any way, or did you feel like she was able to kind of keep that down and hide that from you?
For the most part, she did a pretty good job until I was 21. Looking back, kind of in hindsight, there were again, right, some tells of like sometimes holidays would be really generous and then sometimes it was really sparse. I kind of always associated that with how good we had been for the year or something like that, but it wasn't until later on, after I was introduced to it, that she was able to kind of divulge that like, oh yeah, Spirit Mountain Casino paid for Christmases in 2007 and 2011, whatever. It can be hard, especially like as a parent, like you don't necessarily want your kids exposed to the trials and tribulations of gambling, but you do want them to kind of experience the euphoria of it. Right. And I certainly went through that in my own addiction. I believe that the 12-step book even talks about how people with gambling harm, who have experienced gambling harm, tend to be very philanthropic, right? That they want to take care of their loved ones. They want to be very, very generous and altruistic. And that's true. Having to accept that total package with that euphoria also comes a lot of like pain and harm. We try to separate those two things, both for ourselves and certainly for our loved ones.
It's funny how something someone says 2 years after you stop doing something can still have a really strong impact. I think I still struggle with that idea of being philanthropic.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm almost catching up on lost time and that I have to be twice as generous as I was when I was gambling to make up for it, even though no one's really thinking that way. It's just me.
Right.
Do you feel that way now?
I think I've been able to resolve some of it. I mean, not all of it. I mean, I'm a little over 7 years into my recovery journey and still kind of feel like I'm making up for lost time because there was over a decade of harm that came from it. And that's my own personal stuff that I'm kind of working through. Again, it's almost like a chicken and the egg thing. Am I philanthropic and altruistic because of the gambling harm, or have I always kind of been that way and that contributed to the gambling harm? Earliest memories, I feel like I was like showing up for people. I feel like I tried to be helpful and generous when I could be. I came from limited resources, but if I had extra snacks, people got snacks. Yeah, so I don't know that that's something that's ever really going to like change, but it might be something that I can kind of tap into and be very intentional with that philanthropy. Right? Like, how do I want to show up for people? Is it always going to be with like gifts or money, or can it be other things like showing up with an open heart and being able to help people, bear their load? There's a certain philanthropy that goes along with that too, I think, which is why we talk about being of service.
Yeah, there's definitely some pros and cons to the situation. We've set the scene now. In the timeline, you're now 21 years old and you're getting into commercialized gambling for the first time. What's that experience like?
A whirlwind. I mean, the kind of like early experiences, particularly the early wins at the time, felt wonderful. It was pretty quickly after that, I'd say within a year, that we experienced the economic crash of 2008, right? So maybe a couple years in. Now all of a sudden, the idea of like playing for entertainment and getting a little bit more money and all of that, all of a sudden it became like, this is a way that I might be able to survive being laid off from my job and being on unemployment that isn't covering all my bills. And also being a member of like a union that I can't just go out and like find another job. Like, I have to call into my union hall to keep my membership active, right? I felt a little bound by some of the restrictions, and here gambling with those early wins was kind of presenting itself as the answer to the dilemma. And some months made good on its promise, and some months it absolutely did not. And things were really dire for a number of years. Once I was able to kind of like find new work and change my professional field and all of that, the gambling didn't stop just because I got more stable income. It just kind of looked at that as an opportunity to do even more, right? And that's something that I kind of always hearken back to, is recognizing the promises that gambling made for me, the holes that it was looking to fill, because it wasn't always about money. Sometimes it was about the stress of not being able to provide for my, at that time, 3 children. But a lot of times it was about coping with stress and being able to silence the chaos in my head of being so kind of out of sorts. And so it's interesting that gambling also became the source of so much of that chaos, while simultaneously promising to be the response and the answer. And so just that idea that like I could go somewhere for a little while, every click of the button just kind of seemed to make the voice a little quieter, the chaos, the storm in my brain just a little softer, a little quieter, a little easier to tolerate, to where I'd give almost any amount to just have that sense of numbness. It's not even that I felt good. It's just that numb was preferable. So that's when the real financial damage really started happening, was when it became the quieting of the storm. Didn't matter that I was losing all my money. I had a moment of peace. My mom was diagnosed with cancer, and as it's looking like it's gearing towards terminal, and she's young, she's 49 at this point, right? Through all of that and just that need to silence the chaos and the pain and the hurt, I ended up developing such severe behaviors that I started stealing money from like protected demographics of people. And this is the part of the story where I do like to kind of offer a like buckle in, right? Whether you want to call it an activator warning or a trigger warning or whatever, right? Like, there's financial abuse that occurred in my story, that I was working at a group home for people with developmental disabilities and had access to their checking accounts. And so now it became like, here's this thing that I know is against every value I've ever held. It's also the only way that I can get that silence, that peace, that composure, to at least feel reasonable. So that went on for about 6 months until a financial audit was looming, and I turned myself in to the police as a perpetrator against a protected demographic. That was really like where things kind of like turned around. right? Some people like to talk about their rock bottom. If there is a rock bottom, I do feel like that was the moment for me where like this is no longer something that I can survive. This is no longer something that is not just intolerable but non-survivable. This is a threat to my well-being. Like this gambling behavior is no longer something that even the most primal part of me can view as safe. And I think that there's a lot of motivation that happens when something is now a risk to safety. And maybe that's where the whole idea of rock bottom comes from, is just like when it's no longer safe, people have a little bit more of that, like it's not even motivation, but that full steam ahead, I will do anything to get away from this, right? And I don't want to mitigate people trying to change behaviors before it gets to that point, because I do think it's possible. I just think that there's a certain survival instinct that hits at rock bottom that you kind of have to supplement anything before then.
If I think about gambling, I think about it in kind of like this wave of ups and downs. And any of the downs, if they're significant enough, I feel like that's an intervention point in which you can start to kind of say, all right, that was terrible.
Yeah.
I should change something about this. And does it have to be the lowest of the low points? I don't know. Maybe it has to be a low point. That's always been the way that I kind of looked at it. Do you feel the same way?
I do. Yeah. I think that any of those moments that just tap into that consideration, that's a valuable moment. And we can use that moment at whatever point you decide that like maybe change is valuable to me. That's the best moment to start acting. And again, like I don't believe that the quote rock bottom has to occur. I just think that maybe in lieu of that, we need like compassion and patience, and maybe it'll take a few tries. And it doesn't mean that you're not motivated. It doesn't mean that there's nothing that you're morally in deficit. It means that change is hard, and we know this. We know that change is really hard to do. And so can we also, while taking it very seriously and really trying to put our determination forward, can we also offer a little bit of grace to the fact that it might take a few tries to get there?
Well, you told us that you were taking money from a protected demographic and it was going against your morals. At the time that you were doing this, were you intending to put the money back after you won?
Oh yeah. That's and it started in a very small denomination. Not that makes it any better, right? In the eyes of ethics and all that, it could have been a quarter. It doesn't matter, right? And I'm aware of that, and I was aware of that at the time. But the idea is that it started as a fairly manageable one until it wasn't, until I lost that and then had to borrow more to try to get that back. So I started chasing losses with other people's money. And I am sure that there are people who are going to be kind of foaming at the mouth to talk about the moral implications of that. I'm aware of it. Like nobody has ever said anything about my story that I wasn't already thinking of myself. Like that's just being very real. I also felt that I was morally bankrupt. I also felt that it was apprehensible and unforgivable. What do I do with that? Well, I try to make those living amends like as often as I can, because it's the only thing I can do at this point. I can't go back and change it, but I can try to work to prevent people from getting there themselves. I can try to be of service so that people don't feel like they have to escape as much or shoulder as much of that burden for themselves. So yeah, I mean, I turned myself in and was here in Oregon. There was one judge who happened to have some education around gambling disorder, and that was the judge that was overseeing my case. Wow. Not because he had a certification, he was just next up on the Rolodex of like, this judge gets this case, and it just so happened that he had some experience with some education around gambling. And so between him and the DA, who in looking at all of the information that was gathered, the DA had said, we don't believe that Mr. Ward is a bad person. We think he got caught up in a bad thing. And that was probably the first time that I was able to kind of internalize some of the compassion, that like this person whose career is to try to put people like me in prison is offering me a little bit of grace around this. Like if he's doing it, why can't I? That created a little bit of an emotional shift for me.
And what did that recovery journey look like for you?
Anything that was recommended to me. Here in Oregon, we have our own helpline, 1-877 My Limit. The national helpline, 800 Gambler, can connect anybody to state resources anywhere in the country. But here in Oregon, I called that number. I got a Gamblers Anonymous meeting list, and then I got set up with a counseling agency, Lewis and Clark Problem Gambling Services, to know that there were resources available, to know that I didn't have to be alone, and that there were people who were willing to show up. I can't begin to express the gratitude around that. And within 2 days of calling the helpline, I was in my first counseling appointment. I was going to my first GA meeting. Within a month, I think, I had enrolled in peer delivered services here in Oregon. We call it mentoring, certified gambling recovery mentors. Then I think within like 3 months, I had started doing smart recovery, self-management and recovery training to learn like skills and tools to actually like cope with urges and manage my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And I felt like I took on a lot pretty early on and kept that going for a few years. When the pandemic hit, some things shifted. I became a smart facilitator so I could open a meeting. And 12-step, although very valuable in building my sense of community and all that, I'm also a musician who does martial arts. And I had some pretty strong foundation in my sense of community. So whereas I'm eternally grateful for the compassion that meeting offered, it kind of became that, like, I think I got it from here. Like, I don't think I need this for the rest of my life. But that's not to sell it short. It was supremely valuable early on. That kind of gets into the kind of stages of change, going into maintenance mode of like, I'm able to pull back some of the supports and kind of rely on my own foundation of the early momentum of not gambling. And then after a couple years, I became a certified gambling recovery mentor myself, as well as the smart facilitator. I started on the board of Voices of Problem Gambling Recovery, which is a local grassroots advocacy group that advocates, educates, and promotes recovery, and kind of worked up through that to where now I'm the president of the board of directors. And then I most recently received certification to be an international gambling recovery specialist and a board approved recovery advisor through the International Gambling Counselor Certification Board. So nowadays, my life kind of looks like a lot of advocacy, a lot of that kind of service work. It's time for me to be thoughtful. It's time for me to try to be very mindful of my decisions. That I was working at a group home for people with developmental disabilities and had access to their checking accounts. And so now it became like, here's this thing that I know is against every value I've ever held, but it's also the only way that I can get that silence, that peace, that composure.
I'm going to put myself in the mind of a 13-year-old TikTok troll. Why talk about gambling every day? It seems like you can't leave it behind. It seems like some part of you wants to gamble again. Why are you talking about it?
First, that's a pretty astute 13-year-old, right? Wow, they are getting sharper, younger. But I think the answer kind of lies within that, right? Is because even in kind of more stable recovery, I found a lot of value in being able to talk about what I went through. It's not that I'm like hyper fixated on it or some sense that like I'll never escape it. It's almost like wound care, right? Changing out the bandages and kind of checking in on it to see where I'm at and having that kind of conversation with myself. In a lot of ways, the conversations that I have with people who are early in their recovery are the conversations I'm hoping to be able to have with a younger version of myself. If I can show up for people who maybe not where I was, but may end up there. A lot of times you'll hear people say, is there anything you could have that would have been said to you that could have diverted you, could have changed your trajectory had you stopped gambling? And a lot of times our answer is like, no, right? Like I'm not sure. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth the try. It doesn't mean that like I'm going to stop showing up. I don't typically subscribe to that notion of like you don't want it bad enough or you haven't hit your bottom. No, I'm here for it, right? And if I can speak to people like I'm speaking to a younger version of myself, saying you don't have to go this route, you still have decisions. In a lot of ways, I feel like I'm kind of mending the relationship with that past sense of self. Whether you subscribe to like internal family systems therapy or psychodynamic therapy, this idea of like speaking to your younger self and kind of reparenting, to me, that's kind of an externalized exercise at this point. In being able to show up for other people, I am in some way showing up for that younger version of myself who really needed me and who still kind of needs me.
So it serves a dual purpose of helping to even further your own recovery while hopefully getting someone that's heading down that road at least more informed about where they're going. Let's talk challenges in your role. Is there a particular type of peer that comes in that you struggle to connect with? And if so, what do you do to kind of bridge that gap?
Trying to keep it more to questions.
Mhm.
Like, the thing is, I'm not going to be able to relate to everybody, and certainly not everybody's experiences, right? Pretty early on in my training was made to kind of like recognize certain privileges that I'm born with, all of that. There are things that I might be able to relate to certain people on, and then that's as far as it's going to go, right? It
Mhm.
may be that the only connection piece that we have is that we both have experienced gambling harm. That's a start, right? I like the phrase that we're more alike than we are different. I mean, that's down to like a cellular level, right? Like we just have the closer genetic markers than separate. So really trying to kind of hone in on what the person is saying rather than how I can relate to it. It's a struggle for me for this day because I want to be relatable. I want to be understood as much as I want to understand.
Mhm.
And so really kind of like having to check that and say, you're not going to be able to understand all of it. Doesn't mean that you can't bear witness to it. Doesn't mean that you can't still show up and be present with this person. When people are calling because they are hoping for help that is different than the help that I'm able to provide,
Mm.
that's probably where I'm going to see the most disconnect. If people are calling because they're looking for some sense of understanding, that they're looking for some sense of emotional support, like, we're probably going to, regardless of our differences, we're probably going to be able to show up together. If people are looking for me to come up with resources for their rent to be paid, that's a pretty limited resource, one that is tricky for anybody to tap into. And if I'm not able to kind of immediately provide that, that's probably where people fall off the quickest.
Mm.
And I get it, right? Sometimes people are looking for answers. They physiological needs are at risk, right? They don't know where their next meal's coming from. They don't know where their next rent payment's going to come from. It's really hard to get people to like dig deep into their emotional well-being when they're in survival mode.
I get a lot of messages like, "Hey, can you pay my rent, or can you give me $200?" And then
Yeah.
I'll respond with like, "Here's all the places that you can go to get help for a gambling problem." And they're like, "Dude, kick rocks, like, shut up. I
Yeah.
want you to pay my rent." And it's like, they're just not there yet. So
Right.
I can relate to that.
Just being aware that like our brain wants to see patterns and then say, this may not be the pattern. I haven't collected enough data yet. I wonder what continuing this conversation will do. A lot of times people will surprise you. A lot of
Mhm.
times, if you can bear witness to their pain for a moment and they're willing to engage you for a moment, a lot of times you can kind of find that happy middle ground of,
Mhm.
I am here to support you, just not in the way that you think you need yet.
It's almost like a microcosm, because I imagine that like the desire for our brains to find patterns might actually lead people to continue gambling, because if they had a big win earlier on, they're going to associate continuing to gamble with making progress to eventually get that payout. And so that's an exact situation of, if you can take a step back and kind of view it for what it is, you can see that that's not actually what's going to happen over and over again.
Yep.
So just to kind of tie it back in.
Absolutely. That is such a thing that I had to recognize, is like, yeah, my brain looked for patterns all the time. If I go at a certain time of the month, the machines are hot. I say in quotation marks. Or that going at a certain time of day, or having the right formula of button pushing and screen swiping. Like, we think because some experience has convinced our brain that there's a pattern here, and maybe it's only that 2 times something occurred, maybe twice at the end of a month I ended up with a somewhat substantial win. So in our brain, the end of the month is the time to play. Our brain doesn't like random at all. That's true with gambling, but that's also true with interaction.
Let's get a little bit of a picture of the progress that you've made. Not that we haven't gotten it already, but how would you deal with a bad day while you were gambling versus how would you deal with a bad day if you had one today?
Back then, when I had a bad day, it was, nothing's wrong. I've got this. I am strong enough. Nothing's going to break me, right? There was almost this like toxic positivity of, the world will not break me, right? And then in order to cope with that, I would go gamble to quiet the chaos inside. Nowadays, the internal dialogue's a little bit different. The internal dialogue might be something like, you know what, today did kind of break me. Today did create some cracks, but I have the tools to fix it. I have the tools to manage it and maybe even grow and flourish from it. I don't have a hard time acknowledging hard days now. Being able to talk to people about it, being whether it's my wife or my band, right? Just being able to have kind of open dialogue and say, I'm kind of struggling and it's hard. The first time I allowed somebody to see me cry was a very cathartic moment. And so I think a lot of it just has to do with being able to be honest with myself, to be this old soul that I had to carry so much weight and feel like I couldn't be a burden to other people. Like that wasn't fair to such a young person, with the expectation that like, once we've gotten through this, what are you going to do about it? Bad days are fine. What are you going to do about it? So I'm a big fan of the phrase, feel your feelings and choose your behaviors. I've gotten better, I think, at both of them.
If you're looking to find out more about Brian, his music, and what he's doing today, then check out the description of this video for links to all of that, as well as links to get help if you're struggling with a gambling problem. If you want to hear another story of gambling harm, then check out this video, and let's keep getting better together, one day at a time.